Rich man abandons his 4-year-old blind daughter on the highway, but this horse was watching everything and does something that shocks everyone. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel. To support my work, your help is very important. The pre-dawn air in June cut like an icy blade along Route 66, which connected Flagstaff to the Arizona countryside. The wind whispered through the ponderosa pines, carrying the damp scent of earth and the promise of more cold in the hours to come. Inside a silver pickup truck, Alaric Vanderbilt adjusted the rearview mirror and watched his daughter, Isabella, sleeping in the back seat, wrapped in a thin blanket that barely protected her from the cold, seeping through the cracks in the vehicle. Alaric was 52 years old, with graying hair meticulously combed and hands that had never known manual labor. His dairy factory had thrived for 2 decades, supplying cheeses and yogurts to supermarkets in 3 neighboring towns. A respected man in the community, he attended church on Sundays, greeted neighbors with calculated smiles, and maintained an impeccable facade of an exemplary citizen. But that morning, his eyes reflected a coldness that contrasted with the warmth of the truck's engine. Isabella was 4 years old, and her blue eyes had never seen the world around her. She was born with congenital blindness, a condition that Alaric had always seen as a burden, a silent shame he hid from acquaintances. The girl had light brown hair that shone even in the dim light, and her small hands always sought textures and shapes to understand the universe she couldn't see. She knew her father by the sound of his heavy breathing, by the shuffling of his feet on the wooden floor of the house, by the scent of the cheap aftershave he wore every morning. The pickup truck slowed down and stopped on the shoulder. Alaric turned off the engine and remained silent for a few minutes, watching his daughter's peaceful breathing. The sound of crickets mingled with the rustling of dry leaves that the wind pushed across the road. He opened the door slowly, making sure not to produce any noise that could wake Isabella. "Daddy will be right back," he whispered, more to himself than to the sleeping girl. Alaric walked a few yards to a nearby tree, pretending to answer a call of nature. But his steps didn't stop there. He kept walking farther and farther away from the pickup truck, farther and farther away from the daughter, who trusted him completely. His dress shoes sank into the damp earth, but he didn't care about the dirt. Nothing mattered except getting away from the burden he had carried for 4 years. Isabella woke up to the cold that began to seep into the vehicle after the engine was turned off. Her hands groped the seat in search of paternal warmth, but found only the cold fabric of the upholstery. "Daddy," she called out, her voice still hoarse with sleep. The silence she received in response made her heart race. She knew all the sounds of the pickup truck: the ticking of the cooling dashboard, the rustling of the plastic seats when someone moved, even the different sound the air made when the vehicle was empty. And at that moment, she knew she was alone. "Daddy, where are you?" she shouted louder, and her voice was lost in the vastness of the morning. Alaric was almost 100 yards away when he heard his daughter's desperate cry. For an instant, his steps faltered. A tiny part of his conscience still worked, still recognized the monstrosity of what he was doing. But he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and continued walking toward the spot where he had hidden his motorcycle hours earlier, meticulously planning every detail of that abandonment. Isabella got out of the pickup truck with difficulty, her bare feet touching the icy asphalt of the highway. She wore only a thin cotton dress, inadequate for the plummeting temperature that morning. Her hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from terror. She had never been alone like that, had never experienced the absolute helplessness that now consumed her. "Daddy, I'm scared!" she shouted again, turning her body in all directions, trying to capture some familiar sound. The engine of a motorcycle echoed in the distance, but the sound was quickly fading away. Isabella couldn't identify the noise as being produced by her father. To her, it was just another strange sound in the terrifying symphony of the night. She sat on the shoulder, hugging her own legs in a desperate attempt to warm herself. Her tears began to roll silently down her cheeks, reddened by the cold. The wind swayed her hair and made the thin dress cling to her thin body. She didn't understand what was happening, couldn't process the idea that her father, the only person she trusted completely, could abandon her in such a cruel way. The hours dragged on with torturous slowness. Isabella alternated between shouting for her father and remaining silent, listening attentively to every sound of the morning, hoping to recognize the familiar footsteps returning to her. But the only sounds that reached her ears were the wind, the crickets, and occasionally the distant rumble of a truck passing on the highway. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably. The temperature had dropped even further, and the humidity of the air made the cold penetrate to her bones. Isabella curled up even more, trying to form a small ball with her own body, an instinctive survival strategy that her body had developed. Meanwhile, Alaric arrived home, parked his motorcycle in the garage, and entered through the back door. He took a hot shower, put on clean pajamas, and lay down in his comfortable bed. Before falling asleep, he muttered to himself the words he would repeat. In the coming days, Isabella went to live with her aunt and uncle in Phoenix for specialized treatment. It's better this way. On the highway, the girl remained sitting in the same place, calling for a father who would never return. The sun began to rise slowly on the horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that Isabella could never contemplate. She had spent the whole night on the shoulder, waking and sleeping in irregular intervals, always waking up, hoping to hear her father's voice calling her name. But silence continued to be her only companion, interrupted only by the sounds of nature that gradually awakened for another day. Her lips were cracked from dehydration and the intense cold of the night. The thin dress clung to her thin body, damp with the morning dew. Isabella felt hungry, a hunger unlike anything she had ever experienced. At home, even when her father was impatient with her, there was always food on the table. Now, her stomach contracted in painful spasms that made her double over. "Daddy," she murmured with a hoarse voice, but this time it wasn't a desperate cry. It was almost a prayer, a whisper laden with a sadness she couldn't fully understand. The morning advanced, and some vehicles began to travel on the highway. Isabella heard the sound of the engines approaching and moving away, and whenever a car slowed down, her heart raced in the hope that it was her father returning. But the vehicles always accelerated again, leaving her once again alone with her growing anguish. The warmth of the sun began to timidly warm her skin, bringing momentary relief after the cold night. Isabella tried to get up, but her legs trembled, so much that she couldn't maintain her balance. She sat down again, this time trying to find a position that would relieve the pain that was beginning to spread throughout her small body. It was then that she heard a different sound. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the rustling of the wind through the leaves. It was a rhythmic sound, as if something heavy touched the ground at regular intervals. Footsteps. But they weren't human footsteps. They were different, heavier, accompanied by a noise she couldn't identify. Isabella stood still, all her senses on high alert. The sound approached slowly, and she could perceive a deep and rhythmic breathing. Her heart beat so strongly that it seemed to echo in her ears, muffling other sounds around her. The white horse appeared on the curve of the road like an apparition. He was 8 years old, a strong and imposing animal with defined muscles under a white coat that shone in the morning light. His long mane swayed gently with the movement of his walk. His dark and expressive eyes demonstrated an unusual intelligence, an acute perception that had been developed over the years working on the Cardoso Ranch, a rural property located 2 miles from that highway. The animal had escaped from the pasture during the night. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Thunder, as he was known, possessed an independent temperament, and a curiosity that sometimes led him to explore beyond the boundaries of the property. But this time, something different had drawn him in that direction. An uneasiness he couldn't explain had driven him to walk down the road until he found the small, vulnerable figure sitting on the shoulder. When Thunder saw Isabella, his protective instincts immediately awoke. He had grown up on the ranch taking care of orphaned calves, defending smaller animals from predators, and demonstrating a kind nature that impressed even the veterinarians who knew him. There was something in the girl's posture, in the way she curled up against the cold, that awoke in him the same instinct that made him protect the farm's young. Isabella heard the sound of hooves stopping very close to her. Her body stiffened. With fear, she didn't know what was in front of her, only perceived that it was something big and unknown. Her hands trembled as she tried to move away, but she didn't have the strength to get up and run. Thunder lowered his head slowly, bringing his muzzle closer to the girl. He could feel her fear, perceived the trembling in her small body. With extremely careful movements, he touched his muzzle gently on Isabella's arm, a gentle touch that wasn't intended to frighten her, but to communicate his peaceful intentions. The warm and velvety touch made Isabella sigh. Her hands, which had been trembling with fear seconds before, moved instinctively toward the animal's muzzle. When her fingers touched the soft coat, she felt a wave of warmth and safety that she hadn't experienced since she woke up alone in the pickup. "Truck! You're a horse," she whispered, and for the first time in hours, her voice didn't carry only despair. Thunder remained still, allowing her to explore his muzzle with her small hands. He could feel the fragility of that child, perceived her vulnerability. In a way that transcended verbal communication, his instincts told him that she needed protection, care, and he was willing to offer it. Gradually, Isabella relaxed. She rested her face on the side of Thunder's head, feeling the warmth that emanated from the animal's coat. It was the first feeling of comfort she had experienced since the abandonment. The horse remained patiently in the same position, as if he perfectly understood her need to feel safe. Minutes passed, and a silent connection began to form between them. Isabella didn't need to see the horse to feel his kindness. She perceived it in his calm breathing, in the way he moved with extreme care around her, in the patience with which he awaited her hesitant movements. Thunder, in turn, recognized in the girl a wounded soul who needed care, and his generous heart opened to welcome her. When Isabella tried to get up again, her legs failed once more. But this time, Thunder was there. He positioned himself next to her, lowering his body enough so that she could lean on his strong neck. With extremely slow and careful movements, he helped her to stand. The sun was already high when they began to walk together down the road. Isabella kept one hand supported on Thunder's neck, feeling the security that his presence provided her. The horse adjusted his steps to her slow rhythm, stopping whenever he felt she needed to rest. They walked for almost an hour until Thunder led her off the highway, following a narrow trail that led to a spring of crystal-clear water. The animal knew that place well. He had drunk from that water many times during his escapes from the farm. He lowered his head and drank, and the sound of the water awoke in Isabella a desperate thirst that she didn't even know she felt. With Thunder's help, she knelt at the edge of the spring and drank the fresh water with her hands cupped. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The icy liquid went down her parched throat, bringing immediate relief. She drank until she felt satisfied, and then she wet her face, feeling the water cleanse the dry tears and the sweat of despair. Thunder watched her attentively, and when she finished drinking, he helped her to stand up again. But Isabella was exhausted. The combination of emotional trauma, hunger, dehydration, and the night spent outdoors had exhausted all her strength. She leaned on the horse and closed her eyes, feeling safe for the first time since the abandonment. The horse understood that she needed to rest, He lay down carefully on the ground next to the spring, creating a warm space where Isabella could snuggle against his belly. The warmth of the animal's body enveloped her like a living blanket, and for the first time in almost 24 hours, she managed to fall into a deep sleep. Thunder remained awake, vigilant, his ears alert to any sound that could represent danger to the girl who was now under his protection. Clementina Ferreira woke up on Thursday with a strange restlessness in her chest. At 67 years old, she had developed an acute intuition that rarely deceived her. A rural worker all her life, her calloused hands knew every inch of land of the modest ranch where she had lived alone for 15 years, since she was widowed. Her grey hair was always tied in a simple bun, and her brown eyes reflected the wisdom of someone who had faced many storms in life. That morning, while feeding the chickens in the yard, Clementina heard a sound that made her stop immediately. It was the whinny of a horse, but it came from an unusual direction. She knew the sounds of the area well, the mooing of the cows from the neighboring farm, the barking of the dogs protecting the properties, even the rumble of tractors working in the distant fields. But this whinny seemed to carry a different urgency. She dropped the bucket of corn and walked towards the sound, crossing the small orchard of apple trees that separated her house from the spring where the animals of the region used to drink water. Her steps were firm despite her age, conditioned by decades of work in the field. Her heart began to beat faster when she realized that the whinny was repeated at regular intervals, as if the animal was trying to draw attention to something specific. When Clementina reached the clearing where the spring was located, the scene she found made her legs tremble. Thunder, the white horse from the Cardoso ranch that she knew well, was lying on the ground with something small nestled against his body. Initially, she thought it might be an injured animal that the horse was protecting. But when she approached, a few steps, she recognized the unmistakable form of a child. "Good heavens," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. Isabella was deeply asleep, curled up against Thunder's warm belly. Her thin dress was dirty with earth and completely inadequate for the cold that had occurred during the night. Her cheeks were pale, with reddish spots caused by exposure to the weather. Her light brown hair was tangled, and there were small scratches on her arms and legs. Clementina approached slowly, not wanting to frighten either the child or the horse. Thunder raised his head when he perceived her, but did not move from the spot. His intelligent eyes seemed to communicate something that she understood immediately. The animal was protecting that girl and would not allow anyone to hurt her. "Easy, Thunder," she murmured in a sweet voice. "I know you, boy. I know you're a good boy." The horse relaxed slightly upon recognizing the familiar voice. Clementina had occasionally worked on the Cardoso ranch during harvest times, and Thunder remembered her as a kind person who always brought brown sugar for the animals. Isabella woke up to the sound of voices. Her blue eyes opened slowly, but she remained still sleepy and confused. The female voice was unknown, and this made her apprehensive. She squeezed Thunder's coat tighter, seeking security in the animal that had become her protector. "Hello, little one," said Clementina in the softest voice she could muster. "My name is Clementina. Are you hurt?" Isabella did not respond immediately. She turned her face in the direction of the voice, her ears capturing every nuance of the maternal tone that Clementina employed. There was something in that voice that reassured her, a genuine kindness that she recognized instinctively. "I can't see," she whispered finally, her voice still hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. Clementina's heart contracted. She had noticed something different in the girl's eyes, a particular way she fixed her gaze, without really focusing on anything specific. The revelation of blindness made everything make more sense. The extreme vulnerability of the child, the way Thunder had assumed such an intense protective role. "I know, honey," she replied affectionately. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" Isabella nodded shyly, The mention of food made her stomach contract again, reminding her of how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten anything for almost 2 days, sustaining herself only on the water from the spring that Thunder had shown her. "I'll help you get up, okay?" Slowly, no rush. Clementina held out her hands carefully, allowing Isabella to touch them, first before making any movement. When the small, cold fingers touched her calloused palms, she felt a wave of maternal protection that she hadn't experienced in years. Thunder remained lying down while Clementina helped Isabella to get up. But as soon as the girl stood up, the horse rose too, positioning himself close to her like a silent guardian. It was clear that he did not intend to abandon his protégé. "It's okay, Thunder," said Clementina, understanding the situation. "You can come with us. We'll take care of her together." The trio walked slowly towards Clementina's ranch. Isabella walked between the woman and the horse, one hand supported on Clementina's arm and the other touching Thunder's neck lightly. Each step was a small but significant victory, considering the trauma she had faced. Clementina's house was simple but cozy. Built of exposed brick, it had 2 small rooms, a basic kitchen, and a spacious yard where she grew vegetables and raised some chickens. There was no luxury, but there was love and care in every corner of the property. She led Isabella to the kitchen and helped her sit down in a wooden chair. Thunder positioned himself near the window from where he could observe the girl without hindering Clementina's movements. "I'm going to prepare some nice warm oatmeal for you," she said as she lit the gas stove. "My granddaughter used to love it when I made it for her." Isabella heard the sound of the pot on the stove, the sound of the spoon stirring the ingredients, the sweet smell of the milk heating up. They were sounds and aromas of home, of care, of safety. For the first time since the abandonment, she began to feel that maybe she wasn't completely lost in the world. While the oatmeal cooked, Clementina watched the girl discreetly. Isabella was clearly well cared for before appearing there. Her hair, although dirty, was well cut. Her nails were clean, and even her dress, although simple, was of good quality. She wasn't a child abandoned due to poverty. There was a story behind that situation, and a story that probably involved deliberate suffering. "What's your name, honey?" she asked as she served the oatmeal in a small bowl. "Isabella," she replied softly. "Isabella. It's a beautiful name. And where are your parents, Isabella?" The question made the girl stiffen. Her small hands clenched into fists on the table, and Clementina immediately realized that she had touched a deep wound. "My daddy. He said he'd be back," she whispered, and her voice broke. Clementina felt a lump in her throat. The girl's answer revealed more than words could express. She placed the bowl of oatmeal in front of Isabella and guided her hands to the spoon. "Eat slowly, little one. You don't need to talk about it now." Isabella began to eat the warm oatmeal, and each spoonful brought a little more life back to her fragile body. The sweet taste and creamy texture were a balm to her empty stomach and wounded soul. As she ate, Clementina was already making silent decisions. No matter what the story of that child was, she would not allow Isabella to suffer abandonment again. Her home was humble, her resources were limited, but her heart had infinite space to welcome a wounded soul. Thunder remained by the window throughout the meal, his attentive eyes never straying from Isabella. When she finished eating, the horse approached and gently touched her shoulder with his muzzle, as if he was checking if she was okay. "He likes you a lot," observed Clementina with a smile. "He found me," said Isabella, her voice still weak but carrying a deep gratitude. "When I was alone and scared, he came to help me." At that moment, Clementina understood that she wasn't just dealing with an abandoned child and a lost horse. She was witnessing the beginning of an extraordinary connection, a bond that transcended the barriers between species and that had been forged in suffering and sealed by mutual protection. As the afternoon progressed and Isabella began to regain some strength, Clementina wondered who would be capable of abandoning such a sweet and vulnerable child. And more importantly, she was prepared for the consequences of protecting this girl and her guardian horse. In the second week after finding Isabella, Clementina realized that the girl was getting worse instead of better. During the day, Isabella remained apathetic, refusing to move more than a few feet away from Thunder. Her hands trembled constantly, not just from the cold, but from a deep nervousness that seemed to have settled in her bones. She ate little, slept even less, and frequently woke up in the middle of the night shouting for her father. Thunder had become a constant presence in Clementina's yard. The horse had developed a rigid routine. He grazed near the window of the room where Isabella slept, drank water only when she was awake so she could see him, and never strayed beyond a few feet from the house. His behavior caught the attention of the neighbors, who began to ask questions about the origin of both the child and the animal. It was on a Saturday morning that the situation became critical. Isabella woke up with a high fever, delirious and repeatedly calling for the father who had abandoned her. Her thin body was burning up, and she alternated between violent chills and waves of heat that made her sweat profusely. Clementina moistened cool cloths and placed them on the girl's forehead, but the temperature didn't drop. "Daddy, don't leave me alone," Isabella murmured in her moments of delirium. "I promise I'll be a good girl. I won't bother you anymore." Each word was like a dagger in Clementina's heart. The elderly woman understood that the abandonment had been even more cruel than she had initially imagined. Isabella hadn't simply gotten lost, she had been deliberately abandoned by someone who should have protected her. Thunder perceived the worsening in the girl's condition even before Clementina. The horse began to show increasing agitation, whinnying softly near the window and pawing the ground nervously. At one point he completely refused to eat, remaining standing next to the wall of the house like a dedicated sentry. Clementina knew she needed medical help for Isabella, but she didn't have the money to pay for a private consultation, and taking the girl to town would raise many questions that she wasn't yet prepared to answer. She decided to seek out Eulalia, a neighbor who had worked as a midwife for decades and knew home remedies for various ailments. "This fever is from the trauma," diagnosed Eulalia after examining Isabella. "Her body is reacting to the suffering she's been through. She needs a lot of care, medicinal teas, and above all to feel safe." While Clementina cared for Isabella with complete dedication, Alaric Vanderbilt was busy constructing an elaborate web of lies to explain his daughter's disappearance. On the Monday following the abandonment, he appeared at his dairy factory with a carefully rehearsed expression of paternal concern. "Isabella is going to stay with my in-laws in Phoenix for a while," he announced to his employees during the morning meeting. "The doctors there have more experience with her condition. You know how difficult it is for a father to make a decision like that, but it's the best for her." The factory workers, many of whom knew Isabella from the rare times she visited the place, expressed solidarity and understanding. Alaric had built a reputation as a dedicated man, even if some employees occasionally noticed a coldness in his eyes when he talked about his daughter. "It must be difficult to be away from her," commented Joachim, the production manager who had worked at the company for 15 years. "It's a necessary sacrifice," replied Alaric, averting his gaze. "A father does anything for the good of his children." The lie spread quickly through the community. At the market, at church, in neighborly conversations, everyone commented on Alaric's courageous decision to send his daughter for specialized treatment in the capital. Some people praised his dedication, others expressed pity for the forced separation. Father Sebastian, the vicar of the local church, was one of the first to find Alaric's version strange. A man of 58 years, with grey hair and piercing blue eyes, The priest knew his community well and had developed an acute ability to perceive when something was not right. He clearly remembered Isabella at Sunday Mass. The girl always sat in the front row next to her father, and her sweet presence caught the attention of all the faithful. "It's strange," commented the priest to the church secretary. "Alaric never mentioned before that he was considering sending Isabella away. In fact, he always gave the impression that he preferred to keep her close." During Mass the following Sunday, Father Sebastian observed Alaric attentively. The businessman was present as always, but there was something different about his behavior. He seemed more relaxed, less tense than he used to be when Isabella was present. To a casual observer, it might seem like just temporary relief. To the priest, it seemed suspicious. Meanwhile, at Clementina's ranch, the battle for Isabella's life continued. The fever had lasted 4 consecutive days, and the girl had lost even more weight. Her lips were dry, her cheeks had acquired a worrying paleness, and she rarely managed to keep her eyes open for more than a few minutes. Thunder hadn't slept properly since the fever began. The horse remained by the window day and night, as if his vigil could, in some way, protect Isabella from the evil that consumed her. Clementina began to fear that the animal would also get sick from so much stress and lack of rest. It was on the 5th night that the fever finally broke. Isabella woke up in the middle of the night with a cold and sweaty forehead, but lucid for the first time in days. Her first word was a weak but clear whisper. "Thunder?" The horse, who had fallen asleep leaning against the outer wall of the house, woke up immediately upon hearing her voice. Clementina, who was sleeping in a chair next to the bed, also woke up and immediately touched the girl's forehead. "The fever is gone," she murmured with tears of relief in her eyes. In the days that followed, Isabella began a slow but consistent recovery. However, the trauma had left deep scars. She had developed an extreme emotional dependence on Thunder, refusing to be in any environment where she couldn't touch the horse or at least hear his breathing. When she tried to walk, her legs often failed, not from physical weakness, but from a psychological insecurity that made her constantly seek the support of the animal's strong neck. Clementina observed this dynamic with a mixture of concern and admiration. It was evident that Thunder had become more than a companion for Isabella. He was her emotional anchor, her source of security in a world that had become terrifying after the abandonment. During this period of recovery, the first curious visitors began to arrive at Clementina's ranch. Neighbors who had heard rumors about the child and the horse she sheltered. Most were motivated by genuine curiosity and a desire to help, but some began to ask more direct questions about Isabella's origin. "Is she related to you, Clementina?" asked Rosa, a neighbor who lived a mile away. "It's a complicated situation," Clementina replied evasively. "The girl needed care. But do her parents know where she is?" The question echoed in Clementina's mind long after the neighbor had left. She knew she couldn't keep Isabella hidden forever. Sooner or later someone would make the connection, and the authorities would be involved. But every time she looked at the girl embracing Thunder, slowly recovering from a trauma that she couldn't even fully understand, Clementina strengthened her decision to protect her regardless of the consequences. The truth was beginning to become too heavy a burden for one person to carry, and somewhere in town, Alaric continued to live his lie, unaware that his abandoned daughter was fighting for her life just a few miles away, protected only by a kind-hearted old woman and a horse with nobler instincts than he ever possessed. 2 months after the abandonment, Father Sebastian began to ask questions that Alaric did not expect. It was a Tuesday when the businessman received a call from the church secretary informing him that the priest would like to talk to him about family matters. Alaric felt a chill in his stomach, but maintained his composure and scheduled the meeting for the following day. The priest's office was simple, decorated only with a crucifix on the wall and a bookshelf filled with religious books. Father Sebastian received Alaric cordially, but there was something in his eyes that made the businessman uncomfortable. "Alaric, my son, how is the news from Isabella? It's been 2 months since she left for Phoenix." "She's fine, Father. The doctors are optimistic about the treatment," Alaric replied, trying to sound convincing. "That's good. And have you been talking to her? It must be difficult for such a young child to be away from her father." Alaric hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "The doctors recommend that she focus on the treatment without distractions. We talk on the phone occasionally." Father Sebastian nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Alaric's face. "It's interesting because I tried to contact some colleagues in Phoenix who work with special needs children. I thought about connecting them with you, maybe exchanging experiences, but I couldn't find records of Isabella in any of the major clinics in the capital." The blood froze in Alaric's veins. He forced a smile and replied quickly, "It's a private treatment, Father, very discreet. My ex-wife's family has special connections." "I understand," said the priest, but his expression indicated that he wasn't convinced. "Well, if you need anything, any support from the community, don't hesitate to seek out the church." When Alaric left the room, his hands trembled slightly. He realized that his version about Isabella's whereabouts was beginning to raise suspicions, and this made him extremely nervous. He couldn't allow the truth to come to light. His reputation, his business, his whole life would be destroyed if they discovered what he had done. That same week, rumors began to circulate around town about a mysterious child who was being cared for by Clementina in her ranch. The rumors began when the mailman, Manuel, saw Isabella playing in the yard of the house during one of his deliveries in the area. "It was a little girl with light hair," he told his wife that night. "She was playing with a white horse, one of those from the Cardoso ranch. The most beautiful thing to see, but I found it strange. Clementina never mentioned that she had a granddaughter living with her. Manuel's wife, Irene, was known for spreading information with the speed of light. In 2 days, half the town already knew that Clementina was taking care of a mysterious child accompanied by a horse that had disappeared from the neighboring ranch." Joachim, the manager of Alaric's factory, was one of the first to make the connection. During lunch with other employees, he commented, "Have you heard about this child who is with Clementina? They say she's a little girl with light hair. Don't you find it strange? Right now that the boss's daughter is away—" "Joachim, don't start with theories," reprimanded Marta from the administrative area. "Coincidence exists." "Maybe," replied Joachim, but the seed of doubt had been planted. While the rumors spread, Isabella continued her slow recovery at Clementina's ranch. The girl had developed extraordinary auditory skills to compensate for her blindness and the trauma she experienced. She could identify people by the sounds of their breathing, by their steps on the ground, even by the noise that their clothes made when moving. Her hearing had become so acute that she perceived the approach of visitors, long before Clementina or Thunder noticed. "Someone's coming!" she whispered to Clementina whenever she heard distant footsteps on the dirt road. Initially, Clementina thought it was just the girl's imagination, but soon realized that Isabella was always right. This ability became a valuable tool, allowing them to prepare to receive visitors, or when necessary, for Isabella to hide with Thunder in the back of the yard. The connection between the girl and the horse had deepened even further during the recovery period. They had developed their own language, made of soft touches, low whispers, and body movements that only they understood. When Isabella touched Thunder's neck in a certain way, he knew she wanted to move. When she rested her forehead on his muzzle, the horse understood that she needed emotional comfort. "It's as if they were 2 parts of the same soul," commented Eulalia during one of her visits to check on Isabella's health. Clementina agreed. She had witnessed moments in which the communication between them transcended any logical explanation. Thunder seemed to anticipate Isabella's needs even before she expressed them, and the girl reacted to the horse's moods as if she could read his thoughts. It was during one of these observations that Clementina made a decision that would change the course of events. She realized that she could no longer keep Isabella hidden indefinitely. The girl needed proper documentation, regular medical care, a legal situation that would protect her from any attempt to take her back by whoever had abandoned her. On the Thursday of the third week of October, Clementina decided to seek out Father Sebastian. She put on her best clothes, prepared Isabella with special care, and for the first time since she found her, took the girl beyond the limits of the ranch. The walk to the church was slow. Isabella held Clementina's arm firmly with one hand and kept the other supported on Thunder's neck, who walked patiently beside them. Several people stopped to observe the unusual trio, and Clementina could feel the curious glances and whispers that spread around. When they arrived at the church, Father Sebastian received them with surprise and genuine interest. He had heard the rumors about the mysterious child, but seeing Isabella personally was a shock. There was something familiar about that girl, something that awakened a memory in his mind. Clementina. What a surprise! And this must be the girl who is so talked about in town. "Father, I need to talk to you about a very delicate situation," said Clementina, her voice laden with nervousness. They went to a private room, and Thunder remained near the door, where he could observe Isabella without entering the environment. The horse had learned to respect enclosed spaces, but never strayed beyond the distance necessary to help his protégé, if necessary. "Father, I found this child abandoned on the highway 2 months ago," began Clementina, deciding that it was time to tell the truth. She was alone, cold, without food, completely helpless. Father Sebastian listened attentively as Clementina related the whole story: the encounter at the spring, the deplorable state in which Isabella was found, the way Thunder had protected her, the fever that almost killed her, the slow but constant recovery. "And she never said who abandoned her?" asked the priest. "She talks about her father, but always with great suffering. It's clear that she was deliberately abandoned, Father. No one loses a blind child on the side of a highway by accident." While they talked, Father Sebastian observed Isabella discreetly. The girl remained silent, one hand resting on the table and the other extended towards the door, maintaining visual contact, or at least directional, with Thunder. There was something in her features, in the way she tilted her head, that awakened a disturbing familiarity in the religious man's mind. It was when Isabella whispered something that made Father Sebastian's heart stop. "Clementina, my father's horse is nervous out there. He doesn't like it when there are too many strangers around." "Your father's horse?" asked Clementina, confused. "Thunder was my father's before he came to take care of me," explained Isabella with the innocence of a 4-year-old child. "Mommy always said he was special." Father Sebastian felt all the pieces of the puzzle fitting together in his mind. Isabella, Alaric's daughter, the child who was supposedly in Phoenix undergoing treatment, the white horse that everyone knew as being from the property that had belonged to Alaric's deceased wife. The truth was more shocking than he could imagine. Father Sebastian remained silent for long minutes after Isabella's revelation. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of the discovery. Alaric Vanderbilt, a pillar of the community, respected businessman and frequent churchgoer, had abandoned his own blind daughter on the side of a road during a cold night. "Clementina, I need you to keep Isabella safe for a few more days," said the priest in a grave voice. "There are things I need to investigate before we make any decisions." In the days that followed, Father Sebastian conducted a discreet but thorough investigation. He spoke with employees of Alaric's factory, neighbors, people who knew the family. Gradually, a disturbing picture began to form. Several employees mentioned that Alaric always showed impatience when the subject was Isabella, that he avoided talking about his daughter and seemed to see her more as a burden than as a blessing. He never brought her to the company parties, commented Marta from the administrative area. He always said she was sick or tired. Now that I think about it, it was as if he was ashamed of the girl. The priest also discovered that Alaric had discreetly sold all the belongings of his deceased wife, including photographs and mementos that would naturally belong to Isabella when she grew up. Even more shocking was discovering that the businessman had removed his daughter from the list of beneficiaries of his life insurance, shortly after the loss of his wife. Meanwhile, at Clementina's ranch, Isabella continued her transformation. The girl who had been found trembling and terrified on the side of the road was becoming a determined and resilient child. Her connection with Thunder had given her a confidence she had never possessed before. She learned to move around the yard, safely guided by the sounds and soft touches of the horse. "Thunder teaches me where it's safe to step," she explained to Clementina during a sunny morning. "He knows when the ground is uneven or when there's something in the way." Clementina watched, fascinated as the communication between them had evolved. Isabella had developed the ability to interpret the nuances of the horse's breathing, the different types of whinnies, even the tension in his muscles when he carried her on his back during rides around the ranch. The fourth day marked the moment when the truth finally came to light publicly. Father Sebastian called a meeting at the church, inviting several influential people from the community, including Joachim and other employees of Alaric's factory. The businessman was invited under the pretext of a discussion about community projects. When Alaric arrived at the church and saw Clementina sitting in the front row with Isabella and Thunder beside her, his face paled instantly. His eyes widened with horror and panic. For a moment, he considered turning around and running away, but there were too many people present, all looking expectantly at him. "Alaric," said Father Sebastian in a solemn voice, "I believe you recognize your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella turned her face in the direction of the familiar voice, and her entire body stiffened. She held Thunder's neck more firmly, who immediately positioned himself more protectively beside her. I don't know what the father is talking about," Alaric stammered, but his voice betrayed his despair. "Then do you deny that this is Isabella Vanderbilt, your 4-year-old daughter?" asked the priest, rising slowly. Joachim and the other employees present watched the scene with growing indignation. They recognized Isabella from the few times they had seen her at the factory, and the math was too simple to be ignored. "Boss," said Joachim in a voice filled with revulsion, "did you abandon your own daughter?" Alaric realized that there was no longer any way to sustain the lies. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was crumbling in a matter of minutes. He tried a different approach. "You don't understand," he said with despair in his voice. "She's a burden, a blind child, needs special care that I can't offer. I did what I thought was best for her." The words caused a wave of shock and horror among those present. Clementina stood up with her eyes blazing with indignation. "Best for her? You left her alone on a frozen highway without food, without water, without protection," shouted the elderly woman. "She almost lost her life. She spent days with a fever, delirious, calling for a father who abandoned her like she was trash." Isabella began to cry, silently, not from sadness, but from a painful understanding that was beyond her 4 years. She finally understood that her father had really abandoned her on purpose, that all her hope that he would come back for her had been a cruel illusion. Thunder perceived the girl's suffering and positioned himself between her and Alaric. His nostrils flared and his eyes fixed on the man who had caused so much pain to his protégé. It was then that Father Sebastian revealed the most shocking discovery of all. "There's something else everyone needs to know," he said in a grave voice. "Thunder isn't just any horse that found Isabella by chance. He belonged to Alaric's deceased wife, who had left specific instructions for the animal to be kept for Isabella when she grew up. It was the last gift the mother had left for her daughter." Silence was total. Even Alaric seemed impacted by this revelation. "Marina always said Thunder was special," continued the priest. "She believed that the horse would take care of Isabella if something happened to her, and that's exactly what happened. When Alaric abandoned his daughter, the horse fulfilled the silent promise made to the mother who was no longer here. Joachim was the first to stand up. "I no longer work for a man capable of doing that to a child," he declared, removing his company badge and throwing it on the floor. One by one, other employees did the same gesture. In the days that followed, the story spread throughout the region. Customers cancelled contracts with the dairy factory, suppliers refused to work with Alaric, and the entire community turned against him. His company, built over decades, began to crumble rapidly, but true justice came in an even more poetic way. During the investigation into Isabella's situation, it was discovered that Alaric had illegally sold several properties that belonged to his wife, and that, by law, should be kept as inheritance for his daughter. The authorities initiated a process that resulted in the transfer of all assets to Isabella, including the factory itself. Clementina, with the support of the community, and Father Sebastian, initiated the legal process of adopting Isabella. The girl, who had found more love and care in the simple ranch than she had ever received in her own home, blossomed under the care of the woman who had become her true family. Thunder remained Isabella's inseparable companion, fulfilling to the end the silent promise made to the girl's mother. They walked together through the fields, played in the yard, and shared a connection that transcended any human understanding. Alaric, completely ruined and rejected by the entire community, was forced to leave town. His last public appearance was in court during the hearing for the transfer of Isabella's guardianship. He attempted a last manipulation, claiming that he wanted his daughter back. But when Isabella was questioned about her wishes, her answer was clear and firm. "I want to stay with Grandma Clementina and Thunder. They really love me." On a sunny spring morning, 6 months after being found abandoned on the highway, Isabella ran through Clementina's yard riding Thunder. Her laughter echoed through the air, mingling with the sounds of nature that was reborn. She had learned not only to trust again, but to be truly happy. Clementina watched from the porch, with tears of joy in her eyes, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful endings are born from the most painful beginnings. And Thunder, faithful guardian, continued to fulfill his eternal promise, to protect the girl who had become the center of his world, thus honoring the memory of the mother who had entrusted him with the most precious thing in her life.